on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Think tanks have an enormous amount of influence over government policy here in Washington, D.C. Many people have only heard the term. They may have the sense that they do research of various kinds, but they are, among other things, shapers of policy, incubators for future senior government officials, and so on. My next guest has done a study on the funding of the top think tanks in this country, and he joins us now. Ben Freeman is the director of the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative, or FITI. That's a project of the Center for International Policy, and he's the author of the recent report, U.S. Government and Defense Contractor Funding of America's Top 50 Think Tanks. So first of all, Ben Freeman, thanks for coming on the program.
Richard, thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely. And let me start with this, if I may. What was the inspiration or motivation to create this report in the first place?
Yeah, great question. This report actually stemmed from a report we released earlier this year on foreign governments' funding of think tanks in America. In that report, we identified over $170 million coming from foreign governments to America's top think tanks. And that spun some great conversations about think tank funding. And one of the issues that kept coming up in those conversations was about the U.S. government's own role in funding think tanks. And some people had suggested to me that the U.S. government, and specifically the Department of Defense, was one of the top funders of think tanks. And those that work with the Department of Defense, Pentagon contractors, are also big donors to think tanks. And, I'm a good social scientist, so I couldn't let a good question go to waste. So we decided to investigate it. And what we ultimately found was over $1 billion in funding coming from the U.S. government and Pentagon contractors to the nation's top think tanks.
And how does that $1 billion break out? Do you have a sense between government funding of think tanks and defense contractor funding? What's the percentage between them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is the vast majority of that came from the U.S. government, actually. In fact, more than $900 million of that came from the U.S. government. Now, not all of that was the Department of Defense. There was some funding that we identified coming from other agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, a little bit from the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development, for example. But within that government share, the overwhelming majority of it did come from DoD and the individual branches of the military.
So of the remainder, Ben Freeman, of the money that's coming from defense contractors, what would you say, 200-300 million, something like that?
It was a little below 100 million.
Okay.
I can't remember the exact figure, but yeah, it was a little bit below 100 million. And in a key caveat on all of this, I would like to say to your listeners is that though we did what we hoped would be a robust analysis, we're limited on what we could collect. Because there's critical problems here in terms of the transparency that think tanks have about their funding. In the first and foremost problem that we run into is that many think tanks simply don't disclose their funders, and they're not required to by law. And we tried as best we could to get the information from those think tanks. I sent some what I thought were rather nice emails to those think tanks, politely asking them for that information. But despite my kind emails, many think tanks still said that they would not provide that information to us. And think tanks that do disclose this information, they might tell you that they get funding from a defense contractor, but they won't tell you exactly how much. Or they might give you an incredibly large range, say from between $500,000 and $1 million. And as your listeners can imagine, that's a huge range of potential influence that they could have too. So the estimate that we have here, it really is, for a variety of reasons, a very conservative estimate of the amount of funding that these think tanks are getting.
So a good point, and thank you for bringing that up. And just to kind of try to close the loop on that question a little bit, you looked at the top 50 think tanks in the country. What percentage of them would you say provided no information or incomplete information? Did the majority of them provide at least enough to work with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what we tried to do here is we tried to provide our readers of the report with a scale of transparency. And what we basically found was that there were more than 10 of these different think tanks who just didn't provide any of this information. Nothing at all. And as I mentioned, I would email them, ask for the information, and I got varying levels of responses back about all the myriad reasons why they weren't disclosing this information. But then we had another category of think tanks in the report of think tanks who simply list their funders without listing the amounts of that funding. And then the most common category of think tanks, sort of the standard right now, is for think tanks to list their donors on their websites and then provide you with ranges of contribution amounts. Like I mentioned, that $500,000 to $1 million. Or one think tank, the Brookings Institution, for example, has this coveted category of $2 million and above. That could be anything, that
right,
could be,
sure. It could be
10 million. It could be, infinity.
Right. So, and again, we're talking with Ben Freeman of the Center for International Policy. Ben, when you were compiling this report, when you had seen all the data, were there any surprises for you? Was there anything that particularly struck you about your findings?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really jumped out to me was the Rand Corporation in their very robust relationship with the Department of Defense. And folks might be familiar with the Rand Corporation. It's variously called the DoD's think tank, and for good reason. It was originally founded to be kind of an outside research arm for the DoD. And so, its very genesis and creation more than 50 years ago was explicitly to support the DoD with research. And I sort of knew this, and I think other folks do around DC. We sort of know that it's DoD's think tank. What surprised us in the report was the sheer scale of how much money that Rand is getting from DoD. And what we identified was, just going back to 2014, Rand has received almost $1 billion from the Department of Defense and closely related government entities too. And this comprises the vast majority of Rand's budget. And we sort of followed the money after that to say, okay, this is a think tank that's getting a considerable amount of money from the U.S. military. Then what are they saying about the U.S. military? And one of my colleagues, Holly Zhang, did a fantastic follow-up op-ed on this, where she really dug into all of Rand's testimonies before Congress during the same time period. And in her analysis revealed, I guess not surprisingly, that Rand analysts are almost always very supportive of DoD funding. And they may be critical of a particular weapon system here and there, but the overall gist of their advice to Congress is highly supportive of the U.S. military, which again, the U.S. military is their primary financial beneficiary.
So that speaks exactly to where I wanted to go next, Ben Freeman, which is, one possible reaction to hearing of your study is, well, okay, it's the U.S. government. We're supposed to be in a democracy. If they want to spend the money this way, that's okay. But I think what you're suggesting, certainly with Rand and perhaps from some of these other think tanks as well, is, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
Sure.
It seems to me that there could be something, if not deceptive, somewhat misleading, in that if a think tank is receiving large amounts of money from Homeland Security, or more likely Defense Department, and then without that being publicly known, going before Congress, for example, and saying, the Defense Department is doing a bang-up job at Region A or with Tactical Weapon B or what have you, that could, intentionally or not, have the effect of misleading the public into thinking independent experts agree with what our Defense Department is doing. Is that a legitimate concern?
I think that's a very legitimate concern, and I think you really hit the nail on the head there with a few of the different issues that we identified. First and foremost is people need to dispel the notion that there is a truly objective think tank out there, that there is a purely unbiased, unaffected think tank out there, because at the end of the day, who's paying the bills matters. I sort of have a running joke that if you don't think a think tank's funding matters, either you don't understand think tanks or you're in on it and you're already benefiting from this system. On the other side of it is too, there's a very important issue here about transparency. And that's why I'm glad you brought that up earlier. And with think tanks, it's very critical. If you know that a think tank, might be influenced by some of its funders, the next logical step you need to take is to know that think tank's funders. And this is why we think it's so problematic for think tanks to hide their funders. Now, Congress has certain requirements. They're called truth and testimony forms, where folks who are testifying before Congress, and this is only in the House, though. The Senate doesn't have a similar provision. And what the truth and testimony form asks you is to declare any potential funding you might have or your organization might have that can influence the topic of the hearing. Unfortunately, the law is very weak, riddled with loopholes. So many think tanks are still not declaring this funding that they're getting to Congress. And so you have them testifying then to policymakers about issues where they may have a very direct financial stake and nobody knows about it.
And the other dimension of it seems to me, besides Congress, is media exposure and reporting. That you'll see it all the time. They'll even sometimes use the word, let's say, prestigious. Okay, they'll say the prestigious Brookings Institution, not to pick on them, or the highly respected Rand Corporation or whomever, and has concluded that A, B, C, and D. So it seems to me, as a member of the media, that my profession should also be pushing for this. If we truly want to be objective in our reporting, we should want to disclose that Think Tank X did a report. It appears to show this and this. By the way, Think Tank X is funded primarily by, or in large part by, those sorts of things. Does that seem, is that one of your hoped for outcomes as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the mission of our organization literally has transparency in the name. We're trying to do these studies, and we're trying to get the word out there about these funding streams going to these different think tanks for exactly that reason. I think the public is very often deceived in this media environment. And intentionally and unintentionally. Journalists might be seeking an expert, and legitimately the best expert on a topic might be from a think tank who is also who also takes money from the subject of that issue at hand. We found this was true whether we were looking at foreign governments funding think tanks. We found a lot of this, for example, in folks who are providing commentary on issues in the Middle East. People were on the payroll of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, opining on issues in the Middle East that they obviously their employers had a direct financial stake in making sure those revenue streams kept coming. What we're finding here with the U.S. government and defense contractors is a very similar story. A lot of the folks that you hear at think tanks either clamoring for more military spending or clamoring for greater U.S. military engagement in parts of the world, they're sitting at think tanks that receive millions of dollars every year from the U.S. military and from defense contractors who profit from those wars. So what we are trying to do is, at the very least, give the public the opportunity to know about some of those biases of some of these experts they're hearing, and to give journalists the opportunity so that, they don't have to do all the work themselves. We've got the data sitting there for them. If they're worried about a think tank's bias, come and take a look at our website, internationalpolicy.org, and you can find all this information there.
Well, I think you've done a great public service. I hope you continue to pursue this research, and I do encourage people to look up your work. Again, we've been talking with Ben Freeman, who is director of the, let's see if I can remember this off the top of my head, Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative. Is that right?
You nailed it.
All right. At the Center for International Policy. Again, Ben, thanks for doing this work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you very much, Richard. Have a great day.
You too. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.